Hello, everyone. I'm Dave Taylor from LincolnConspirators.com, and today I am so excited to be sitting down and moderating a panel discussion with a truly exceptional group of people. Joining me today are Frank Gorman, Bill Trimble, Michael Kaufman, Dr. Terry Alford, and Stephen Miller. The subject of our talk today is the 30th anniversary retrospective on the John Wilkes Booth exhumation trial. Now, before I start chatting with my very impressive guests, I want to provide a little context regarding our subject matter. For some brief background, in the early 1990s, a pair of historical independent researchers contacted Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore and attempted to seek permission to exhume the body of John Wilkes Booth. Their reason for doing this was their belief that Abraham Lincoln's assassin escaped justice and that a different man had been killed in his place on April 26, 1865. These requests to exhume Booth's remains were denied by the cemetery. And I'm going to share a little picture, little screen here to show what I'm talking about. So, as a result of this denial by the cemetery, the researchers decided to take legal actions in their attempt to force the cemetery to agree to their demands. They filed a petition to exhume Booth's remains in the Circuit Court of Baltimore City. Greenmount Cemetery, as the respondents, sought out legal representation and assembled this team of Lincoln assassination historians to dispute the Booth escaped justice claims made by the petitioners. The end result was 4 days of trial in May of 1995. Now, our 30th anniversary discussion today coincides with the recent publication of a book about the trial. The book is called Confronting Bad History: How a Lost Cause and Fraudulent Book Caused the John Wilkes Booth Exhumation Trial. The author is Francis J. Gorman, the attorney who represented Greenmount in the legal proceedings. And so my first few questions are going to go to you, Frank, to ask you
Okay.
about this book, and then we'll dive into the full panel and go through everyone's memories of the trial. So, Frank, I'm going to start with you. And so my first question to you is, well, the exhumation trial occurred 30 years ago now, in 1995. We're recording this 2 days before the first day of trial. So what motivated you to write this book now?
Okay. Well, the trial was 1995, Dave, as you said. And back then, everything was paper. There were no digital exhibits and this, everything was paper. So for the appeal, I got the transcript, I had all the exhibits. And when the case was over, after the appeal was concluded, I had 5 or 6 banker boxes of this paper. And normally, 2 or 3 years after a large case was over, it would be disposed of, shredded or whatever. But I had in the back of my mind, this is different, and maybe I want to do something with this. So, despite several moves in the past 30 years, I lugged those 6 boxes everywhere I went. And when I started became close to retirement 2017 and 18, I got serious. I started looking through them. I talked to my friend Terry Alford, who encouraged me to put together a book. I had never written a book, and that's why it came out in 2025. I started in 2018 writing, and I had no idea that it wouldn't finish till 2025. So that's how it happened.
So it would have been a little bit earlier, but still, yeah,
Could
it
have
took a
been, but I
while.
didn't have time. I was
Yeah,
practicing law.
absolutely. So the book is more than just the Booth exhumation trial. It's also a historical dive into the circumstances of Booth's death and his burials. And you also provide kind of a biography about the granddaddy of this whole thing, Mr. Finis Bates, the author of The Escape and Suicide of John Wilkes Booth, from which pretty much most of these Booth escape justice theories blossomed. Was the process of doing historical research on this part of the book different from your normal legal research process?
Well, kind of yes and no in that. During handling trials, you're always checking out the major witnesses, as we did in the Booth exhumation trial. So I was pretty familiar with getting the background of witnesses in a case. But what happened here, very briefly, is that I started out with a book just about the trial, the 4 trial days, and the appeal. And it didn't seem to be very exciting. It was actually pretty boring. And then he asked, and then he said, and then he asked, and then he said. And I guess the pivotal moment came in 2020 when George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. And I started getting newspaper articles and seeing things on TV about the lost cause. And I got thinking, I was wondering why Bates wrote the book, since I didn't believe it was true. And that got me down the path of looking into the life of Finus L. Bates.
And what aspects of Finus Bates's life did you kind of find the most surprising or enlightening during your research into him?
Well, I was very surprised of his Mississippi activities. I thought of him as a Memphis lawyer. He was born in Mississippi. He claims he practiced law in Texas for a few years, maybe as many as 5 or 6. And then he came back to Mississippi and held some pretty prominent positions within the Southern Democratic Party. And also, he was city attorney of Greenville along the Mississippi River, at that time a bustling cargo cotton port. So, and then he had some mishaps financially with railroad. And eventually in 1890, after his first wife had died, he went to Memphis. And I had thought of him as a Memphis lawyer. I really didn't know all that background in Mississippi. And then the Memphis story is interesting about what he did there. And I think much of what he did there was working on Booth and then on the book and then on the mummy.
Yeah, and that's why I really enjoy the your book just because I think I disagree with you that the trial part is boring. I found that riveting and I felt the way that you wrote it was so engaging, but your entire kind of the whole second half of the book, I mean, this first half of the book is all about Bates and how he came to be this guy who wrote this book about Booth escaping and kind of the stories about his life that are like, this is why he wrote it. Maybe not so much that he believed it, but he had ulterior motives, and it's just a great read to kind of, get your mind around Mr. Bates. And we'll talk more about him as we keep going with some of our witnesses. But
Okay.
thank you, Frank. So I'm going to turn now. We're going to talk about the pre-trial period. So we have this idea. There's this guy named Bates. He's written this book claiming that Booth escaped justice, and that's kind of the basis for a lot of the problems or a lot of the things we're going to talk about. So the pre-trial period kind of happens over a course of a few years, and we're going to turn now to Bill. So Bill Trimble, if you want to unmute yourself there, I'm going to ask you some questions. Bill, you were an attorney yourself with a long and successful career. How did you end up getting involved with Greenmount Cemetery?
Well, it's very simple. The firm to which I belong, merged with another firm. After we had been a merged firm for about 2 years, one of the senior partners came to me and said that one of the partners had been on the board of the board of managers of Greenmount Cemetery, and also had represented the cemetery, and would I be interested in succeeding him? And after some thought, I said I would. That is how I ended up as being a member of the board of what is referred to corporators in the charter of, but rightly, board of trustees or board of directors.
Did you have any connections to Greenmount before that?
I didn't, but I had a great great grandfather who was buried there.
Oh, okay, very nice. So,
So,
what were the duties of the board of Greenmount, the board of managers of Greenmount Cemetery, or as the president, what were kind of the duties? What all did you do?
well, the cemetery obviously uh, receives remains from various people who wish to be buried in the cemetery, although not as many now as they used to. And the cemetery also operated 3 crematories, which we would provide cremations for various funeral directors. And then there was the management of the endowment funds and an operation of a business, which I think at that point probably had about 25 people working for it in grounds crew and a supervisor and a superintendent.
Gotcha. So I imagine, I don't know when you started officially getting these sort of petitions asking about John Wilkes Booth, but in 1991, I'm sure things picked up because in that year, the TV show Unsolved Mysteries aired an episode highlighting the Booth escaped justice theory. And shortly thereafter, I imagine you all began receiving letters from people who had seen it and from the people behind the show seeking to exhume the remains of John Wilkes Booth in order to prove or disprove this theory. What was the cemetery's response to these initial requests to exhume John Wilkes Booth?
That initial respect was we did nothing until we received a letter from an attorney in Washington, D.C., stating the desires of 2 of his clients to proceed. I should say that the matter of John Wilkes Booth has been the subject of many questions in previous years, to the point that we'd have to keep going through with it and saying, no, we can't do this, we can't do that, or we will not do this, or we will not do this. And so that was the pattern. And our first thing we did is I consulted Frank Gorman, and in my capacity as president of the board, not wearing my lawyer hat. And he said, "We'll just wait and see what happens." That's how it started.
So the first legal petition that you mentioned, that was headed by these 2 researchers, I believe, Nathaniel Orlowick and Dr. Arthur Ben-Chitty, both of whom were involved with the Unsolved Mysteries episode. So why, when you got their petition, what led you to seek out Frank in particular as your consul? And here's a picture of Nate Orlowick and Dr. Chitty, the people who kind of started this ball rolling, legally speaking.
Well, the reason we did is because a petition had been filed in the equity court in Baltimore, and it was 2 people that in our mind had no standing whatsoever, and they wished something accomplished, and which there are laws which regard that. And we realized we were in a legal matter, and so we could see at this point that we were going to have to file a legal response.
And how come you picked Frank?
Well, Frank and I had, when I mentioned that we merged 2 firms, that was one merger. And by this time, I had joined the firm of which Frank was a partner. And so I knew Frank, and I knew Frank was a very fine trial lawyer. And I asked Frank, would he represent the Greenmount Cemetery in whatever proceedings were to follow?
And Frank, you agreed?
Yeah, he came up, Bill came up to my office. I knew Bill, but not real well. I mean, I know Bill well now, and I'm very glad that I do. But he came up, and Bill's a man of directness and not too many words. And he thrust this petition in my hand and said, we just got sued. And he started talking about the case. Well, I started flipping through this 30-page petition and quickly got to the history. And I thought to myself, this is not what I do. I do patents, copyrights, and trademarks. This is all Greek to me. It's all history. And as he's talking and I continue to flip, it struck me that this is a history case of some sort, and I am never, ever going to be offered another history case in my life. This is a one-time opportunity. So at about time I was at page 25, Bill was still talking. I said, I would be happy to represent Greenmount and work with you. He said, fine, and that he left. And so that's how it happened.
Very unique case. I don't blame you for deciding to try it. Um, Bill, as you note in the first petition to exhume, only named these two researchers, Olerwick and Dr. Chitty, but these men had no relationship to John Wilkes Booth or the Booth family, and that's partially why the cemetery, blocked their efforts, because you didn't want to set this precedent that anyone off the street could just get permission to dig someone up on the whim. So we know uh, um, that both Orlowick and Chitty were later removed from the petition and were replaced by two distant Booth relatives who appear to support the exhumation. How at all did the cemetery change tactic, or did you consider that when you had actual Booth relatives on the petition? Was there any change of thinking when that happened?
Yes, at that point, we were definitely a party in the case.
Hmm.
The initial petition had thought basically to sweep us aside as if we had no standing, that we were not parties to the case at all. This particular petition, thanks to Frank's motion, which he filed, the judge dismissed the initial petition with permission to amend, and the attorney in Washington then amended by having two alleged relations of the late John Wilkes Booth as the moving parties. And so we at that point, we were parties, and we had to file an answer, and we did.
So I guess my question is, was there at any point when it was switched to Booth relatives, any thinking of do they have more standing now, as opposed to these two guys off the street who say we want to dig them up on a whim, but these two people who, and one of which I believe had the deed, or at least had access to the deed. Did that at all change
I think a
the
sister had a deed copy.
correct? Not yeah, well, not one of the petitioners, but the sister petitioner had the deed. And was there any thinking at that point, be like, oh, maybe this is something we should let them do, or were you still very much like there is no?
Not. There are specific laws on the Maryland Code which apply to different counties, different political subdivisions, as to what is required if a an exhumation is desired. Uh, and I personally had some of those cases, which were not problems. We simply had to get permission from the state's attorney to move, say, a casket from one cemetery to another cemetery. Not unlike what Mrs. Booth did when John Wilkes Booth's mother, when she consolidated those members of that branch of the Booth family to Greenmount Cemetery.
Absolutely. So you're now in this legal battle in which you're being, have this whole thing. And so when it comes to the witnesses who represent Greenmount at the trial, and on Frank's little team here, which included yourself, a lot of everyone else kind of involved in this were members of the Surratt Society, this group kind of devoted to the study of the Lincoln assassination. How did you, or maybe this also you and Frank, go about finding the historic witnesses that you needed? Was there a relationship that you knew of between you guys and the society? Did you seek out, historians? And I guess, Frank, if you want to join on this as well, I'm just curious how Greenmount found these people who we're going to talk to soon to kind of be the people on the side of history.
I will let Frank answer that because he is the one who accomplished it.
Okay, sounds good.
Well, Bill's being a little generous here. Actually, there are two people that get the credit at the Surratt Society. The first one, Dave, is Laurie Verge. God rest her soul. She's passed away about probably 5 or 6 years ago. And she knew just about everything about the Lincoln assassination. And then the other person was James O. Hall. He was also involved in the Surratt Society, a prodigious researcher and mentor to many. So others who are by Mike Kaufman at that time was very active in the Surratt Society. So was Steve Miller and Terry Offord. All of these folks are writing articles for the Courier. That's the journal put out periodically by the Surratt Society. So I think it would be, and Bill really was the initial contact with Laurie Verge and James O. Hall, and then Bill weaved me into it. And it was just a matter of coming up with the names, and most of the names were suggested by either Laurie or James Hall. And that's how we found who we found.
Well, I think you found a good group.
We did, and unfortunately there's two people here, not here, who were part of the original group. One is James O. Hall, who I mentioned. He was an inspiration, you might say. He was kind of the senior member of the team. And when Terry Offord was the last witness, Steve Miller and Michael Kaufman and Professor Stars had done such a good job that normally, as a trial lawyer, especially with Terry, he hit it off with Judge Kaplan. I would have called it off, last witness, because with Terry's testimony and Michael before and Steve Miller before that, we had hit a high place. Mm-hmm. But it didn't seem right to any of us, including Bill Trimble, that James O. Hall was not going to testify. So we put him on the stand as the last witness. And to no one's surprise, he was terrific. And he was the best cleanup hitter. And so that's James O. Hall. And then we can't forget Professor Hanchett.
We'll get to Hanchett. Give me some time. We're going to go chronologically. Anyway, we'll get to Hanchett.
So it was Laurie and it was James O. Hall.
Good. And now, Frank, you document in your book that April 15th, 1995, the 130th anniversary of Lincoln's death, that's when you had your first in-person meeting with these prospective witnesses. Yes. And that strategy meeting were yourself, Bill, and forensic scientist Dr. James Stars, who you mentioned, and then James O. Hall. And included in there was also two of our other guests here, Professor Terry Alford and historian Michael Kaufman. So I'm going to turn it over to Terry and Mike for a little bit now and talk about their recruitment into kind of becoming these witnesses for it. And I'm going to start with Terry. I'm going to start with you. And I have, of course, wonderful pictures of you all from the time period, just to be a bit embarrassing. So Dr. Alford, here's an image of you a couple of years after. This is from '98 when you were on a panel at Ford's Theater. And so Dr. Terry Alford hardly needs any introduction to anyone familiar with the subject of the Booth family. He's the author of numerous books on the subject, including an edited version of Asia Booth Clark's memoirs about her brother John Wilkes, which came out in 1996. And in 2015, Dr. Alford released his magnum opus, his biography on John Wilkes Booth, entitled Fortune's Fool. Since then, he's followed it up with 2022's In the House of Their Dead, The Lincolns, the Booths, and the Spirits. And these are in addition to your numerous articles and speeches you have given throughout the years on the Booth family. So, Terry, I'm curious. Tell me, what was life like for you at the time of this trial? And what was your history with the Booth story up to 1995?
Well, in 1995, I was working on on the big biography of Booth that you kindly mentioned. And I had done an exhibit at Georgetown University Library in 1985, 10 years earlier. And it drew heavily on their collection, which included the Swain papers, which is a major depository for the David George stuff. And was so busy there using their collection that I became a guest staff member, so I could come and go in the stacks. I didn't have to fill out slips to get things. I just wanted.
Nice.
Yeah, it was. You can wander around, see a box that looked interesting, peek in there. And when I looked at the Swain papers in about 30 minutes, I said, "You got to be kidding! This is all there is. I mean, there's nothing here, right?" And I never followed it up because Mike did such a good job. I mean, he dissected the thing with a scaffold back and forth, and I said, "There's no need to improve what he did. You can't improve it." So I never did any further work on that. And anyway, my interest was always Booth. It wasn't any of the side roads, like who O'Loughlin's grandmother was or the trial, was it legal? I mean, things like that just never interested me. I wanted to know Booth, and real depth. And like at the trial, I was only interested because of what it brought out about Booth or those associated with him. So I didn't follow that up, but I did get a call from Mr. Hall, and he told me what was going on up in Baltimore. And I think we held the meeting you referred to at my college. There was a boardroom there that we could use. Everyone gathered together, and it was, a pretty impressive team, as you say, once you put them all in one room.
I'm surprised you got any words in edgewise with everyone kind of saying everything. I imagine trying to plan everything out is that meme of the guy who's kind of crazy in front of the bulletin board with all the strings going everywhere. Like this is how we're going to do it. Um, Terry, I'm going to go back a little bit. What got you interested in Booth, to begin with?
Well, I've always liked biography. I think that's a good thing, and that's because I like the storytelling aspect of history. Like the people, right? And
Mhm.
and I know it's microcosmic. I know it's just one person, but still, I think it's what people around the old campfire and caveman days, you know,
Yeah.
uh, used to enjoy about history, and I think always still do and always will. So he just seemed like an intriguing character. He was someone, you could put it this way, cut above the other assassin. He was somebody with something to lose, not a born loser. So I was really kind of intrigued by him. The fact that there wasn't a really solid biography about him out at that time.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that he's a unique character in the same way. It's just like he is very different from the other assassins. Like I remember reading the book American Assassins by I think James Clark, where Booth is his own category. It's like he doesn't fit the other assassins and attempted assassins just because he was unique in that way. So Frank refers to you as the calm and thoughtful one during your initial strategy session, and really throughout the trial as a whole. What was your thought process going into this trial?
Well, you have the confidence to know how strong your material is. I mean, they didn't really have anything on their side, enthusiasm and a few kind of old age reminiscences. And it was just like we just had a mountain of things uh, for our side. But as Poincaré said one time, a house is made of bricks, but a pile of bricks is not a house. You've got to erect it, right? You got to put it in some shape. And Frank did really good, and I think we all chipped in and did really well. Putting the evidence together and doing it. To get back to your question, kind of step by step, very deliberative, and it had its aggregate effect. I could see it on the judge. In fact, I remember two things in particular.
Hang
If
on,
you want,
can you save that because I'm going to come back to you to ask you about your testimony specifically, and then I'm going to ask about that. Yeah, because I'm trying to do chronologically, but I'm glad you mentioned that it is building. I like how you said you have bricks and you assemble into a house. Well, contrastingly, the other side has straw that they're trying their best to make into a house, and the smallest little and just knocks it over. Um, Wonderful, Terry. I'm going to get back to you in a little bit. I'm going to switch now over to Mike. So Mike, I'm gonna end up asking you very similar questions right after I show you a nice picture from 1998. This is 3 years after. Same panel that Terry was on at Ford's Theater. So, in the same way that Terry was working on his biography of Booth and had just was just finishing your Asia memoir edited edition. Mike, you published an edited volume of conspirator Samuel Arnold's memoirs during in '95. I forget what year did you publish that? At the same time as the trial?
I think it was about that time. Yeah,
Yeah, so
somewhere in there,
you
mid
were you
90s.
were you were in this at that point, and of course in 2004 you published, the most detailed Lincoln assassination book ever written, American Brutus, John Wilkes Booth and the Lincoln Conspiracies, and it remains the pinnacle of scholarship on the subject of Lincoln's death to this day, and I think will continue for a long time. You are also a longtime narrator of the John Wilkes Booth escape route tours put on by the Surratt Society. And in 2012, you published a guidebook about the route called In the Footsteps of an Assassin. So, Mike, I'm going to ask you the same basic questions as Terry. In '95, what was life like for you? And what was your involvement in the Lincoln assassination story at the time of the trial?
Well, I I had a long time fascination with the story going back to the '60s. I had read Jim Bishop's book, The Day Lincoln Was Shot, and he did such a masterful job of pulling people in with this story. Uh, he made the whole group of people seem so real, fleshed out the characters. It really did everything right as a writer. And I sort of felt as a preteen that that I knew everything there was to know about the subject
Of
after
course.
I finished reading that book, and and so I thought, well, you know what, I'm going to write a book of my own, and the way kids are, and and so I started working on something, and gradually coming into bring folding in other sources, other people's books, of course. And after I got to about 250 pages typewritten of some manuscript, I went back and started reading it from the beginning, and I thought, wow, this is awful. There's so many things I hadn't thought through, and so I thought, by this time I'm living in Southern California, and American history, especially Civil War, just isn't their forte, out
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
Um, so I thought, as soon as I can, I'm going to move to the Washington area, and I'll go to the National Archives and Library of Congress, and I'll get some real sources, and I just sort of aimed for all of that. I turned 18 in 1974, and immediately came out there.
Is this a
Uh,
picture of the young Mike Kaufman?
that that may be lawsuit material there. That
I
is
see
really
1979 on here.
that is as embarrassing as it gets, I think. Well, no,
That's why we're
don't
here.
take that as a challenge, okay? No, that's uh well, anyway, I don't know who that is.
Okay.
But anyway, the so I came to DC in 1974. I had heard an ad on the radio saying the FBI is looking for people. Well, so I applied and took a job with the FBI. Well, that happened to be uh, right between it. The headquarters occupied the entire block right between Ford's Theater and the National Archives. Doesn't get any better than that. I could go to the archives or Ford's Theater during my lunch breaks, and then after work, I would go again. The archives is open till 9 o'clock, 6 nights a week, and that's how I spent all my time. And and really, from the first day, I started noticing things that didn't strike me as familiar at all. I've read these books, and that's not in there, and I thought, well, I'm just going to keep on going at it, and I knew I was a kid. I mean, really, give me credit. I knew my limitations, and And I said, I've got all the time in the world to just do it right. And so I spent all my time at the National Archives, at Ford's Theater, some a little bit later at the Library of Congress, and then gradually folding it in. But here's the one thing that I did that really stoked my enthusiasm. My first weekend down there, I started looking up uh, people in the phone book who had the same last name as people who were at Ford's Theater, and I started
Just cold
calling these
calling.
people. Yeah, just cold calling and saying, "Are you related to that person?" Eventually, I found um, a granddaughter of Henry Rathbone and Clara Harris,
Wow.
and she didn't have the same name, but I got it. I got the name from Ford's Theater files, and I said, are you the granddaughter?" And she said, "Oh my goodness, nobody's ever asked me that before." And she said, "Why don't you come over, and in the meantime, I'll see if I have anything that would interest you." And oh yeah, she had her grandmother's diary. She had her
Wow.
grandmother's jewelry that she wore the night of the assassination. She had a lot of information and a scrapbook. It turns out that Rathbone and Harris um, were collectors of all the social niceties. You know, they had the calling cards and photographs of people who were high in Washington society, including the Lincolns and the
Wow.
Grants and all these other people. And among the things that were some notes that were passed from Lincoln's deathbed to her great grandfather, who was a United States Senator, Ira Harris. And some of them had blood on them. And oh my gosh, I'm never going to let this story go. I
Yeah.
really, once you see things like that, and I did this, I found this lady,
Yeah.
you know, it gives you this sense that what else is out there, Um,
You get bitten. I mean, you were already bitten by the bug, but that just
oh
confirms that
yeah,
this is a lifetime thing now.
absolutely.
So
And
how did you, I mean, you then just kept going with it. How did you end up getting recruited into Frank's gang, as it were?
well, by that time I was pretty well known, among insiders. I hadn't written a whole lot. I was terrified of getting something wrong in print,
Hmm.
and then having that come back to me later on. So I didn't write a whole lot, but everybody knew me, and they knew that I was up to my eyeballs in research all the time. So, yeah, it seemed probably to them like I was a natural choice. I was doing the escape route tours, so I had a lot of public speaking experience and all of that. And so, I guess that's what it was. It would have been um, maybe a little bit awkward to leave me out of it, and
How did
at that point.
how did you feel about being asked to participate in the proceedings? Were you excited by it? Were you scared by it? Like going in front of a courtroom and all that stuff. Like, yeah, what were
Yeah.
your feelings about it?
uh, Terry just said it best. It's hard to be scared about it because you have all this confidence that how can we lose?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I had been to Georgetown University Library, and I had seen the Swaim papers, which incorporates the Finest Bates papers, and a lot of the material that went into the book was in there, and I thought, oh, this is wow, this is it's going to be like beating a dead horse. Um, so yeah, it was hard to be scared about it. I mean, I wasn't big on you know testifying in court. I didn't have any experience in that, um, but as for the rest of it, sure, let me at them.
Yeah, it was an exciting thing, I imagine, to try to be asked to take part in.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Just like Frank,
Absolutely.
Frank couldn't turn down the case, even though it was out of his wheelhouse. And for you and Terry and Steve, who I'm going to talk to next, this was definitely in your wheelhouse. It's like, yeah, put me in, coach. I'm ready.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. All right, thank you, Mike. We're gonna then switch over then for the third stooge over here. So, according to Frank's book, Mike, you're the one who suggested our final guest as another possible witness. That's what he says. So, I will blame you for, I guess, making me introduce a dear friend of mine, Mr. Steve Miller, and I have a picture that he was kind enough to share his own blackmail. So, here's a picture of Steve from 1990, so 5 years, and he's at Tudor Hall there, holding a nice hat. So Steve is a dear friend of mine from the state of Illinois. He's an author of numerous articles about the troopers of the 16th New York Cavalry. I can hear myself through you, Steve, so give me 1 second. Yeah, so the 16th New York Cavalry who tracked down and killed John Wilkes Booth at the Garrett Farm. He is the owner of the Millington Paraday Papers, a collection of letters belonging to two members of the 16th New York, and he is a noted expert on Boston Corbett, the Avenger of Lincoln. In the aftermath of the 1991 Unsolved Mysteries episode, Steve authored numerous articles helping to debunk the claims that the man killed at the Garrett Farm had red hair. So, Steve, hi there. Had you heard rumblings about what was happening, legally speaking, before you received a phone call from Mike and Frank asking you if you'd be willing to testify?
Well, I was in touch with the folks from the Surratt Society, and I knew a lot about it. Um, I've always been a reader, and there were certain major events that I had studied through that. Never thought in my wildest imagination that I would ever write anything. Like Mike, I think the first thing that I ever read was Jim Bishop's book, which was excellent. And I would go through, and there would be certain topics that I would follow. There'd be, oh, there's a new book on Custer's Last Stand. Oh, got to read that. Oh, something new on the Alamo, and different things like that. And I never thought that I was going to find anything new. That I'd always been a reader because that was pretty much the way that I grew up. I'm originally from Oregon, the West, and about as far from Garrett's Farm as you can get, and would grew up on old Western historical magazines, True West, and things like that. When I was originally in Oregon, and I found when I was at the University of Oregon that there was a newspaper article that mentioned that two of the soldiers that were at Garrett's Farm ended up in Portland. And so I started trying to find out more about them. I made contact with the Millington family. That was pretty easy because they were still descendants. And about the same time, I graduated from the university and moved to Chicago. In Chicago, I had already been a member of the Surratt Society and had gotten involved with Richard Sloan's The Lincoln Log, which was a wonderful publication, had a lot of contacts and things like that. But I didn't know any of the people involved in it. Suddenly, I found out that a neighbor of mine, practically, Janine Clark Dodell's, was a member of the Surratt Society and lived about a mile away from where I was. I finally made contact with her, and she introduced me to a lot of the people. We went back and took the escape route tour. I believe Mike was the guide on that, and I at that point I had thought that I would follow up and see if I could find the parody people out in Illinois or out in Portland. And a friend of mine volunteered to, who was still living in Portland, volunteered to see if he could find out, make contact with them. And he was able to find the granddaughter of Emory Parody. That's a parody there. And I called her up, and she said, "Oh, yes, I remember. I was a little girl, and I remember my grandfather very well. I had some papers of his at one point. I don't know if I still have them. I was going to throw them out when I did my spring cleaning. My family's never been interested in it. I'll see if I have them." And it turned out she did. And eventually I was able to go out and meet her. And I asked her what she wanted to do with the papers, and she gave them to me. And then right after that, I met the Millington family too, because they were still in the Portland area, and they gave me some of their papers. Not quite as nice a set as the things that I had. So, like Mike, I ended up scoring big on the first thing that I ever did. I wish I had been able to find more information and score again, but I'll take any victories I can get. The letter that's in here was one that Parody wrote to his parents 2 days after Booth was killed. And in a short letter, he described the whole business about how Booth was resistant to being taken and various things like that. And I was just amazed that I had this thing, and I think that was something that has prompted me to that played a big role, for instance, in the trial, because of some of the comments and things that they made. So at that point, I thought, well, okay, I'm going to finally write something, and I'm going to write an article about Millington and Parody, and I'll write the things like that, and that's it. I go back to my reading. Janine introduced me to Constance Head. A lot of us remember that, Dr. And along the way, with the correspondence and things I had from her, she said, "Oh, I have an article about another soldier that was at Garrett's farm." Well, that just ruined me at that point. I had to go ahead and say, all right, what happened with all of these guys? And I'm still pursuing that all of these years later. Um, this got me interested not in the broader text of the assassination itself. I've always considered myself to be a specialist in here. I'm concerned more with what happened with the soldiers, that happened with the controversy over whether Booth was killed. But like I've gotten who said that, not interested in the legal aspects or things like that. That's
That's what
way too broad
Terry
for me.
said. He was a Booth guy, not so much some of the
Oh
other
yeah,
stuff. Yeah.
and I respect that, because there's so many things. Someone will go, oh look, I've gone here, and here's the history that I've written about the flags at Ford's Theater. Oh, here's the history that I've done on the railway car and things like that. And I've tried to limit myself with all of the things. I met Mr. Kaufman along the way. We got to be good friends, and we shared a lot of information through that. And I've always respected the things that all of the other people have done, but I've tried to stay away from this. I haven't been able to get back to the other subjects that I was interested in things, but I'm still pulling on this thread and going through all of that.
So,
Um,
what were your
I knew
thoughts?
that
Oh,
the
sorry. Go ahead.
unsolved I knew that the unsolved mysteries thing was coming up, and I also knew that one of the stories had been around was that there was the guy named Wilson Kinsey who lived up in Beloit, Wisconsin. It's not that far away from me, and that he had said that the man that he was there, and that the man had red hair, and so he knew that Booth escaped and things like that. So I decided to uh, do some research on that, and I found quite a bit of information. That was one of the articles that I did in the wake of the Unsolved Mysteries thing, because in the Unsolved Mysteries episode, uh, they're going through the whole business where the the soldiers are there and they just shot Booth, and suddenly these two guys walk in off camera, and one of them is Sergeant Kinsey, and he's, oh no, I knew him from New Orleans, and that's not him. And then this Lieutenant Allen walks in, and it's like, well, these guys weren't on any of the records, and nobody else mentions them. So I decided that I was going to follow up on that, and did some research on the two of them. I'll tell a story in a minute about how I got in touch with the Allen family.
Wonderful.
But that was my primary thing. And then suddenly there was talk of that there was going to be this hearing and attempt for the exhumation and things like that. And Mike roped me in. Thanks, Mike, to suggest that I come and talk about these two people on the basis of the articles that I'd written in the Surratt Courier.
Were you excited about being asked to become? I mean, so far, both Terry and Mike seem they were pretty excited to be asked. How about you?
Well, I felt like I was a fish out of water, that these were people who knew a lot more about it. And I'm just, concentrating on the little soldiers and the little gang that I had there. And I was flattered and honored and a little bit scared to get invited. But um, at the time, my wife and I had a graphic arts firm, and we were pretty busy. It was just a two-person thing. And at first, they asked me this, and I thought, "Wow, geez, we're pretty busy with a big project, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to." And so I didn't answer right away. But the next day, I called back and said, "Yeah, I'll come, but I'm going to have to limit it." And that's why, luckily, I was able to testify out of order, I guess you'd say. I think I was one of the first ones that came in, but I brought my little documents and everything and went through all of that. But
If anyone's out of order, it would
yeah,
be you, Steve. So that's good.
I'm glad I did. And I don't know what the project was 30 years later, so it
But you
doesn't
remember
matter anymore.
this. You remember this. Wonderful. All
Yeah,
right.
well, I will break in to say, Steve, you're much too modest. There wasn't any little papers that you brought. He brought the Millington parody papers, which is a tremendous, chunky,
Thanks, Steve.
full of facts. You brought that to the trial evidence, and thank you.
I've got them on the shelf back up here still. So,
That's good. All right, thank you, Steve. So the team is assembled. There, Avengers assembled. Here you all are. So let's get to the trial. So the trial began on Wednesday, May 17th, 1995. And so, Frank, can you describe your arrival to the courthouse in Baltimore on that day? What was the atmosphere like? How are you feeling about your plan for this case? Oh, Frank, you're muted still. Yeah, it's hard when we have to go back and forth.
Yeah, I was saying for me, it was basically a one-off case, although, and that was all of my cases were one-off cases. They were long trials, and when the case was over, the client hoped they never saw me again, because it was expensive usually. So this was just another case, I thought. I had a federal court scheduling conference at 9:15. That ended at 9:30. Judge Kaplan had said be in court by 10. And so I walked east on Pratt Street and then took a left and headed up Calvert. And as I was walking, looking ahead, I could see these satellite dishes, and I said, "Oh, I wonder what that is." And I got closer and they came bigger, more in view. And I realized, oh, well, maybe somebody's pled guilty. Some politician or some bigwigs been caught for something and they're getting sentenced, or it's his first day of trial or something. So when I got up there, I could hardly get into the door. At that time, the attorneys had a pass to let you in. So I was able to kind of weave through the crowd and get in. But once I got inside, then it was a wait to get on the elevator, and the elevator was jammed. And I'm sure there were others there too. I know Terry Alford was there, Mike was there. So we all saw this very crowded situation. And when I finally got into the courtroom, which was the biggest one in that courthouse. So, Dave, I was looking around and I saw Trimble's head. He's a tall guy. And so I made my way to Trimble and I said, "Bill, what the H is going on?" And he said, "I don't know." And the last anecdote, as I was talking to Bill, all of a sudden a microphone was thrust into outside my face. And a woman came over. I think she was from CBS, probably a name we'd all recognize, but I'm not sure. And she says, Mr. Gorman, your opponent is quite willing to have this trial televised live on network TV. Is that okay with you? So I said, well, let me check with my client. Now, I knew instinctively what Bill Trimble was going to say to this. And so I said, Bill, they'd like to televise this. Hell no. That's why we're here. We don't want that kind of disruption to the cemetery. So I turned back, and fortunately, I was able to say to her, no, there's no need to do that because the court itself is videoing this. So there's no need for you to televise it. She wasn't happy. but she retreated. So anyway, that was my first day. I was uh, taken aback at how many people were there.
Yeah, a lot of press, even though they didn't let you go inside. Yeah, so I like these pictures. I imagine these pictures I'm showing are from at the end of the trial. I'm guessing that this was, or maybe it's during after a certain day of the trial.
Yeah, I can't remember,
Yeah.
but you can see James O. Hall
Yes.
right over the palm, and there, of course, is Bill Trimble there. And
Yeah.
this kind of media attention was what happened throughout the trial.
Well, and was I imagine this was unusual compared to your normal cases? You weren't
Yeah,
normally giving interviews?
yeah. I don't think of all the cases I tried, maybe once was mentioned in the paper with 3 or 4 lines. This was totally out of the ordinary for me.
Absolutely. All right, so let's go into day one. So the first day saw the opening statements by the two groups and then testimony of witnesses on the part of the petitioners. And these consisted of the two Booth relatives who Orlerick and Chitty had convinced to kind of be the face of the petition. And they are Virginia Klein and Lois Rathbun, the first two here. Then the rest of Lisa Booth, who also claimed to be a relative of the Booths, and then the rest are the scientific team who would take part in the exhumation, and the identification proceedings if the exhumation was granted. Now, from my reading of your book, Frank, you seemed pretty happy with how the first day went, as through your cross-examination, you were able to demonstrate that really only one of the witnesses who testified on this first day really seemed to believe that a different man was buried in Booth's grave. And this was one of the distant relatives. All the rest of them were kind of just like, well, we don't know, but we're, maybe do it, or we're scientists. This is how we would help out if you did grant it. And so, and none of the petitioner's scientific witnesses endorsed the idea of the exhumation, just said what their role would be if one happened. Were you surprised that these were the witnesses the petitioners chose to start with?
Uh, well, no, I wasn't surprised that they were going to lead with their strength. And a guy like Douglas Uberlacher, Dr. John Smilyak, and Paul Sleznick, they are home run hitters. They were well known in their field, well respected, very experienced. Um, and of course, it was to be expected that the two petitioners would probably start off. Virginia Klein was a very lovely woman, and she wanted the exhumation, but she wasn't in any way upset or rigorous or insistent. She was very matter of fact, very pleasant. And the same can be said about Lois Rathbun. Um, and I might add here that later in the trial, the judge decided that Lois Rathbun was the next of kin and had the standing because she was the great 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 grandniece of John Wilkes Booth and the great great granddaughter of Edwin Booth. And then Lisa was a lovely woman too, and her story was based on the Bible. But let's get to the three main witnesses. Douglas Uberlacher had a wonderful reputation. He'd done a lot of anthropologists and had done quite a few exhumations. But he realized but he was a professional and true. When something was not certain, something couldn't be delivered, he said so. I might add, we did have the help of Professor Stars, who we'll get back to sometime here today.
He'll be next. Yep.
He was helping with Bill Trimble assemble questions that I might ask Mr. Uberlacher. And he said things like, we're unlikely to get a positive identification. He said, when I asked him how long it's going to take, he said 6 months or so. And I saw Judge Kaplan, kind of perk up at that. He also said that he was going to take the body to Washington. And that was concerning because that's taking the body out of the jurisdiction that Judge Kaplan had in the state of Maryland. And he assessed the situation pretty well. And then John Smilyak was the state medical examiner, also a heavy hitter. And he pretty much brought everything down to earth as to the complexities of making an ID from somebody that's been in the ground so long. and Paul Sludlik as well. He's the one that told us point blank there'll be no DNA, despite the fact the petition promised that. So these were all really strong witnesses, but they were also the kind of witnesses who would not try to oversell.
Yeah,
So we did pretty well the first day.
absolutely.